Hello. So my name is Benjamin Perry. I'm a freelance writer and an assistant editor for Time Inc. And I'm here today with Emily Brewer, who is the director of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. Emily, can you describe a little bit, what PPF does?
Sure, yeah. So PPF is one of the historic peacemaking organizations across, there's several in different Christian denominations. And we started during World War II to help Presbyterians who were conscientious objectors during the war, both to help them through that process and to give them a community of other conscientious objectors. And we've been going for over 70 years, and we are now a nationwide organization of Presbyterians and others sometimes, who are committed to what we call active nonviolence. And we really ground ourselves in the words of the prophet Isaiah, who has this vision of the people when they will beat their swords into plowshares. And he says, and nation shall not rise up against nation, and neither shall they study war anymore. And so we really feel a commitment to anti-war and to standing against war in its various forms. So that can look like a lot of different things in this day and age, but those are our core commitments.
And part of it, I know, is you actually do go to conflict zones with some regularity to be a presence there. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to be present in those kinds of places where there is a lot of violence?
Sure. Yeah. So one of our programs that has been going on for a little over a decade is the Columbia Accompaniment Program, is what we call it. And that happened, like I said, it began over a decade ago, when a lot of the Presbyterian pastors in Columbia were receiving death threats and other threats on their lives and their families' lives for the work that they were doing and speaking out against the violence in their own communities. And this was violence that was largely perpetrated by either the Colombian government itself or by paramilitary groups that were kind of working for the government. We hear a lot about the guerrilla in Colombia, but actually they are responsible for a much smaller fraction of the violence. And most of the communities of Presbyterians that we work with were really in areas and communities that were being threatened by the paramilitaries. And so some of these pastors asked Rick Ufford Chase, who is the moderator of the Presbyterian Church at the time, so kind of the head of the Presbyterian Church in the United States. They said, this is what's going on. We're terrified. Our congregation members are dying. And Rick said, what can I do? And they said, send people to accompany us. And so Rick went to the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, of which he was a part, and then became the director of. And they began this program on virtually no budget. And so we continue to send two folks, usually from the U.S., although we've had some folks with other international passports who go. And they go and they accompany the communities there and the individual pastors there. And it's a way of both showing the communities that they are not forgotten, that we care about them, that we feel this bond to them, an expression of solidarity, as well as it also is a show to the paramilitaries that often control the areas. And it says, hey, we're watching. And if something happens to one of these people, we'll know about it. And it works uniquely because the Colombian government and the U.S. government are strong allies. We have several U.S. bases still in Colombia. And so the Colombian government really has a lot of interest in making sure that U.S. citizens who are visiting their country are not harmed in any way. And so that affords a level of protection for the U.S. citizens, and their presence affords a kind of protection for the Colombians who are there. But it's really, it's an exchange. And I know when I served as an accompanier in 2012, before I was the director of PPF, it was really an experience in which I went to accompany, but I felt very accompanied too. So we talk about this kind of mutual accompaniment that happens when we do that kind of international solidarity work.
Wow. Yeah, and I know you just came back from a trip to Iraqi Kurdistan. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, a lot of people would suggest that a large source of the conflict in that region is related to sectarian religious differences, between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, and as well as, other ethnic groups like the Kurds and the Yazidis. I mean, would you agree with the assessment that a lot of the conflict is religious in nature?
I think that we talk about a lot about our religious differences, and I think two things. I think one, that's in part a pretty Western understanding of how religion works, that we kind of divide ourselves along these lines. And a lot of the folks who we met in Iraqi Kurdistan and other folks that I've heard speak from Syria and other places in the Middle East really say, like that's a kind of US and Western overlay of understanding our reality and our culture. And they often identify first as Syrians, or first as Kurds, and secondly, with their religious tradition. And in Kurdistan, a lot of people were actually kind of skeptical of religion because it has been used in really manipulative ways by extremists from all traditions. And the second thing I would say about it is that I think that talking about conflicts that we usually hear about in the Middle East as being really sectarian and religious conflicts is a way of diverting attention away from the fact that it's really about economic interests of outside countries often coming in and taking resources and controlling the economies of these local communities, for example, in Iraqi Kurdistan. For example, in Iraqi Kurdistan, there are a lot of international oil companies that are present there and that are really destroying the land. And the actual process of extraction is really harmful to the land and to the people, and also creates all kinds of economic disparities. And so I think that talking about the violence in some of these places as being strictly religious diverts our attention away from the fact that it's really outside economic interests that are at play and that are creating a lot of this violence. And I think it's often, for those of us in the US and in the West, in our best interest to ignore that reality because it's particularly mainly us who benefit economically from the exploitation of these other communities and countries.
So if you wouldn't say that the source of these conflicts are primarily religious in nature, at least not in the ways that we traditionally hear about them discussed in Western media as being religious in nature, do you feel that religious traditions have a role to play in solving conflict?
Yeah, I really do, because even if the reality is that these conflicts are more complicated than just Jews versus Christians, or Muslims versus Yazidis, or Muslims versus Jews. The reality is that a lot of extremists in different religions use their own religion to justify violence. Mm-hmm. And I think that they're wrong, and I think that they're in the minority. But I think that also means that there's a real role for the rest of us to play who also share those same faith values, to use those values and say, actually, we feel that because of these values that we hold, at these religious values, that we're called to peacemaking, and that we are called to active nonviolence as a form and a way of living out our faith when we see violence. So pacifism, and particularly Christian pacifism, the tradition that I'm most familiar with, comes not from a point of turning away from violence and ignoring violence when we see it, but to showing up when there is violence and being a nonviolent, active presence in the face of violence. It's not a passive or turning away from violence. It's really showing up and being there in a different way and offering an alternative to violence.
So what would your response be to people who say that the best way to remove violence is to sort of create a post-religious society where nobody's religious, and then we won't have any religious extremists?
I really think that's it's hard for me to imagine that. And I think it's not just because I'm a religious person. It's hard for me to imagine that world, because I think that humans really seek meaning from our lives. And I think that religions, at their core, most of them try to answer the questions of why are we here, and what are we supposed to do here on this earth, and how do we relate to each other, and how do we relate to these feelings that when we often feel connected to something much larger than ourselves. And we might move to a point where we talk about those in terms that are beyond like Christian terms or other religious terms that we use now, kind of outside of that framework. But I think that humans will still be trying to answer those same questions. And so as long as we're trying to answer those questions, I think that that's kind of where religion comes from, even though it might look different. And so I think that it's hard for me to imagine some kind of post-religious world. Although I do think that a lot of our religious institutions have become just as much kind of a part of the empire that we see around us as anything else. And when we see religious institutions that have lost their integrity, that have lost their ability to critique power and to stand against power, I think that those institutions really need to either rethink or die away. But I don't think that those religious institutions are necessarily what's carrying out kind of the heart of religion.
Yeah, that was actually definitely something I was going to talk to you about. We were on a trip a couple of years ago to El Salvador, and talking to people who were involved in the Catholic Church, during the revolution there, but both in the period preceding it and the period afterwards. And a huge part of that story is the complicity of the Catholic Church in, with the government of El Salvador, and really with the governments, oppressive governments throughout Central and South America. The Catholic Church was oftentimes very much invested in maintaining an unjust status quo. When you have situations like that, do you think it's better to work within those kinds of institutions, as we saw people doing, priests who were actively working to use liberation theology to create a new form of Catholicism, or do you think it's better to try to eliminate those institutions that are not functioning the way they should and try to replace them with something different?
Yeah, that's at the heart of the question for a lot of young religious leaders today, as you know, Ben. And I think, so Ben and I went to seminary together, and this is the question that a lot of us are grappling with. Like, do we get ordained? Do we become Christian pastors and kind of official Christian leaders so that we can help reform the church from within? Or do we stay outside of the structure so that we don't feel as beholden to the structure when it is really operating in ways that are unjust and unethical, as institutions are wont to do? And, I think for me, I can speak for myself. My position currently within the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship kind of puts me, I think, right along that line. And that's a place that feels really, it's not necessarily a comfortable place. Like, it's kind of hard to stay there because I feel myself being pulled either just reject the church and say, you know what, it's beyond saving. And let's just go do this justice work separately. And then I feel myself at the same time often pulled into the church and into the allure of having a big pension and, having some of these other things that often come with
just the little stuff,
right, with being a part of kind of an institutional church. And I think that my work with the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship kind of keeps me in line, in a place where I'm still connected to the church and can help reform it in places and ways that I can. But I'm also changed by it. And, it's within the church that I have found some of the relationships that have really challenged me the most in ways that have helped me grow. And so I'm really grateful for that. And I think that's really the way that church is supposed to work. It's a real community. And then also, I'm still pulled toward kind of the margins of our society and places that I think that to justice movements and things like that really are where Christians, I'll speak for Christians, I think are called to be, but we often find ourselves locked away in our churches instead. And there's plenty. I think it was Henry Nouwen who wrote about that we are really called as Christians, and I would think probably also as people of faith in general, to stay in that space that's kind of uncomfortable sometimes, but that we stay in community for those of us who are religious, we stay in those religious communities and faith communities, and we both try to reform them and let them change us, because they're also not all bad.
Yeah.
But certainly need reforming.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about. in your own religious upbringing, was peacemaking something that was really stressed in, the church you grew up in? How did you feel like your own religious education, when you were growing up in the church, either prepared you or did not prepare you for the work you ended up doing?
Um, I would say that I came to peacemaking later. There were certainly some folks who were more leaning towards the anti-war and peacemaking side of things, but that certainly was not the tone of the faith community in which I grew up. I grew up in a church in a fairly small town in East Tennessee that called a woman pastor when I was probably in the 5th grade. I was pretty young. And that was like a big deal for the surrounding town. It wasn't so much of a big deal for the church I was in. It was tended to be more progressive. But for a few people in the church, it was a big deal to have a woman as a pastor. And I just remember being a kid, and there was lots of letters to the editor in our local paper about how, this was contrary to God, that God doesn't call women to be pastors and stuff like that. And as a young girl, it was kind of confusing. And I thought, well, like, that's just weird. Why would they ever think that? Like, where did they get that from?
Yeah.
And so I think that in that context, I received a lot of messages from my church and my faith community that were really empowering, and they encouraged me to question things and to stand up for what I thought was right. And so I think those values I did get largely from my faith community. But it wasn't until I went to Guatemala for a year as a part of it's called the Young Adult Volunteer Program of the Presbyterian Church. And I learned about the civil conflict there, which was kind of happening alongside the same one that you and I learned about in El Salvador, Ben. And I heard about the state violence, the violence that the government perpetrated against largely indigenous people. Over 200,000 people were killed or disappeared in Guatemala, mostly indigenous, and particularly in the 80s. And I think that's when the first time that I was really with people and communities that had suffered this kind of systemic violence. I grew up in a fairly white, fairly sheltered community in the U.S. That kind of viewpoint is certainly present in the U.S., but it wasn't one that I had experienced until I went to Guatemala. And they really pushed me to grapple with the ways that my faith called me to sometimes stand and speak out against governments or even the church when it was in perpetrating or sanctioning violence. So I think that piece came later, but the roots of trying to stand up for what's right and challenge power, I did get in my early faith formation.
When you were living in Guatemala, and I know you attended religious services, what did you see the churches there acting in ways that were substantially different from, the kinds of churches you grew up in? Vis-a-vis the kinds of violence that they had seen in their country?
Some, I went to a Presbyterian church in Guatemala, and in Guatemala, it's really interesting. Like in El Salvador and other places, the Catholic Church was really the one that kind of organized people and communities to stand against state violence. There were also certainly priests and parishes who were allies of the state, allies of the government, but it was the Catholic churches who largely kind of organized this counter movement to protest the violence that was being perpetrated against the people. But the Protestant church has a pretty different history, and actually the government brought in Protestant missionaries to counter the Catholic Church. And so there's still sometimes this strain of we just don't talk politics in the Protestant church in Guatemala. And so that was kind of interesting. But even that, this kind of aversion to talking about politics, I think can also sometimes be seen as a kind of a lingering effect of a community that has been traumatized by violence, and that it's just really hard to face it or to talk about politics, to speak out against the government when that was so often what got people killed. So I think it's kind of it's a very nuanced, I mean, and what I just described was very simplistic. It's much more nuanced than I could explain, and much more nuanced than I will ever understand, because I'm not a Guatemalan living there.
Yeah.
But that you can see a lot of the ways that people are trying to both survive and find meaning, and find meaning in community together in Guatemala, and that manifests in different ways in different faith communities.
If I could, change tacks a little bit, one of the things that's very striking about the kinds of work that you do, and I imagine probably less so for you when you're doing it, but for people who don't do that kind of work, is that you do go to a lot of places in the world that are fairly dangerous, and you assume some degree of risk, and in the kinds of work that you do. How does your own faith fuel that work, both the desire to go do that kind of work that obviously could not do? You could stay home safe in the US and not worry about things. How do you feel sort of pushed by your faith, and how also when you're in situations where you're not necessarily safe, how do you find faith as a resource that helps you cope with physical instability?
Well, I think first of all, what I have found often is that I tend to get anxious sometimes when I'm going to a place that in the U.S. news is painted as just so dangerous, and why would any U.S. citizen ever go there? Places like Colombia, places like Palestine, places like Iraqi Kurdistan, and they're portrayed in our media and often by our government as these just kind of horribly violent, backwards places, which I think is a kind of cultural elitism, and has some racist and colonial overtones to it as well. But I find myself affected by some of those paintings of portrayals of other cultures and places. And so sometimes I find myself getting kind of anxious before I go. But it always happens, like without fail, that once I get to a place and meet people and walk around and see people and get lunch from a street cart or whatever it may be, it just feels like people are just living their lives. And that's not to say that the violence is not there, and that the systemic violence is not kind of always at least present under the surface, even if there's not just eruptions of physical violence right there. But it also, I think we build it up and think of it as this wholly other place. But also there are people who are shopping and building families and dating and doing just things that humans do. So I think that's one thing, is that it usually feels much less worthy of my anxiety once I'm there than before I go. But also there have been times when I have had other reason to be anxious, like when I'm in a place. And I do certainly get anxious, and I feel my heart beating, and there's this woman, pastor, her name's Amy Cantrell. She's the leader of what's called the Beloved community in Asheville, North Carolina. And she says that when your heart starts beating really fast, that's the Holy Spirit telling you that you are in this kind of liminal place and you have a decision to make. And so when I feel my heart beating really fast, I try to remember those words from Amy, and I think, okay, this is a moment in which I am being called to act, and how am I going to act? And those are often the moments when I think, okay, I'm feeling anxious, but this is a time to kind of model nonviolence and diffusing conflict, and even when I feel like I just want to turn and run. And so I try to approach those moments with that kind of attitude. And also, there's always other people around. Like when I was in Colombia once and had a moment where I thought there was some paramilitary who were talking to us and kind of asking us questions, me and the one other U.S. citizen who I was with. The pastors of the Colombian church that we were with were also there present with us. We were together, and that also provides a kind of a sense of community, and that you're not alone, and that we can figure this out together. So, yeah.
Prayer is something that, for me personally, I have a very sort of fraught relationship with. I didn't really grow up as much of a prayer, and I don't necessarily find the same solace in prayer that a lot of that I hear people do. um, Meditation works sometimes better for me, sometimes not. I was wondering, is prayer something that's part of your, religious practice? And if it is, how do you find prayer or meditation helpful or useful in situations of conflict?
I feel the same way that you do, Ben. And I like always, every once in a while I'll be like, okay, I'm going to start this spiritual discipline where I pray every morning, and it doesn't matter if I have no words, but I'm just going to sit there and pray. And I will do it like 2 days in a row and then forget, and then do it maybe once the next week. But I'm just like not that kind of I've never gotten into the routine of that, of praying by myself. And I think that prayer can look a lot of different ways. But what has worked for me always is praying with other people. And so, for example, when I was in Iraqi Kurdistan, there was a group of about 12 of us, and we had a kind of simple prayer or reflection service almost every day. And those are really moving. And I can't even express why, but there's something about kind of gathering together. And for me, like in the kind of situations of tenseness, I was saying that I find comfort and courage in being with other people. I feel the same way about prayer. It's something that I can almost only do with other people. Maybe that's not great, but that's how it is. And I do sometimes read poetry, or I'll kind of read religious writers who I like, who are really kind of prayerfully, thoughtfully writing. And that feels like a kind of prayer, but really what moves me and also sustains me is prayer with other people. And so for me, that's partly why I'm still, there are a lot of reasons, but that's a main one why I'm still part of organized religion, is that I can't sustain myself on my own.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. And I agree that there is something fundamentally different about prayer when it's happening in a group, or when you're with a group of people. It just feels different. And to me, I mean, maybe it's partly because it feels more like talking with other people, or sort of being with other people and engaging in a communal action, which for me seems more like the point of talking. Whenever I sort of pray by myself, I always sort of feel like I'm just like, well, now I'm talking into the void, like I'm a crazy person, But I don't necessarily get that same push pull with God on my own that I feel, when I'm with other people. And I think there's that, I'm going to say Matthew, where it says when 2 or 3 are gathered, that so too will I be there. That's very much the way that I've always felt with prayer. That when I'm praying by myself, it may help just in terms of my own peace, or trying to calm myself down, or just trying to take a moment of breath. But I don't necessarily feel the Holy Spirit present in the same way as I do when I'm with a group of people, and oftentimes praying with other people and talking with other people. It's in those moments of interaction that I definitely feel the presence of God more than just when I'm sitting by myself going, "Hey God."
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And there have been moments in my life when I have felt that kind of intense connection to something much larger than myself when I'm by myself, but it's not something that I can bring on, I guess, or predict.
Yeah.
But it often happens when I'm with other people.
It's not just like a faucet.
Right.
And people talk about it like that. I always am just amazed and a little jealous. They're like, "Yeah, I just love praying. I just, I feel connected with God." And I'm like, wow.
And it makes me wonder if it's one of those things that, you talk about spiritual disciplines. It really is something you just kind of have to keep at it, and then you kind of get more practiced. I know that that's often how meditation works, that it's learning to clear your mind is so hard. But
yeah, and it's funny.
Maybe it's one of those things where I just haven't been disciplined enough to develop yet.
I've been I had much more success. That's a weird word. Like, so successful prayer. No, I've had much like, but I feel like I've done more meditation, and I feel more the discipline aspect of meditation. When we were in seminary, I had the opportunity to do Professor Chung. There's a resident Buddhist at our seminary, and she had this whole, which she called Zen boot camp, where you woke up at 7 a.m. every morning and you went and meditated for an hour, and just like that, it was a class, and so I had to be there, and sort of that enforced discipline really helped over, that 6-month period. I got very into meditation in a way that I hadn't previously. But even times where I have been fairly disciplined about, prayer, and have gotten myself to pray every day for, a week or two, I just don't feel the same sort of grip. And I think part of it is because meditation, so often the goal is to, clear your mind, to remove things, to sort of strip things away. Whereas prayer, I always feel like I'm trying to add things, I'm trying to come up with new ways to talk, new ways to talk about my faith and how I'm feeling with God. That for me, it's almost easier to sort of just strip all of that away than it is to sort of build on extra layers.
Well, that makes me wonder if I think
are we praying wrong?
Particularly particularly in our in the West and in Christianity, I would say, and also the North. And even more so in the version of Christianity that you and I are part of Presbyterianism, which really
we like our words.
values education in ways that I think are great. But I think the downside to that is often that we think that you have to have words all the time, and prayer is about being eloquent and perhaps resting in silence. We could take a page from the book of our Quaker sisters and brothers, and that resting in silence is really sometimes the most prayerful act, particularly in a world that is so full of words and of trying to achieve things through words and prove ourselves through the words that we use. That resting in silence is really prayer, if we think of prayer as countercultural in a way of connecting with God in a way that we can't find in other places in the world.
Yeah. So in closing, if you had, if you could recommend one or two major fundamental changes that mainstream religions, I mean, you can say, take the Presbyterian Church, or you can, broaden that however you would like. But what changes, in institutional religions really need to be made in order to become more committed to nonviolent peacemaking?
I think one that's easy to point out and not necessarily easy to do is we talk about in governments, that budgets are moral documents. Well, churches have budgets too, and I think that the ways that we use our money, and so not just our budgets, but also a lot of churches, like the Presbyterian Church, for example, has investments. And so what are we invested in? I think that if we took very seriously the call to use our money to express our values, that would fundamentally shift a lot of the ways that the church interacts with the world. In the Gospels, we hear the story of Jesus seeing exploitation and money being used in the temple in unjust ways, and he gets angry and he flips over the tables. And so we know from our faith that the way that Jesus cares about the way that we use our money. And I think that the church often tries to separate money from spirituality in a way that really is economically beneficial to us, but it's not what we're called to do. So
Turn my house into a den of thieves.
Right. Yes, exactly. And so I think if we really took a look at our budgets and our investments, that would be a huge step. And I think the other is to really, this model of accompaniment, of thinking of our faith as being called to both accompany others and to be accompanied. I think that if we understood our calling in that way, it would really force us to begin to dismantle some of the legacies of colonialism that the church has participated in, and racism, and so it would look different in different communities and different churches, and not every congregation can do all things. But I think if we really took seriously this model of accompaniment, of being in solidarity with each other and learning from one another, and just showing up for each other, and listening, particularly to the people with who have less power in the world, what their needs are, and saying, okay, and now these are our priorities as the church. I think that would also go a long way to dismantling some of the ways that the church has and continues to participate in an empire. And I think it would get us much closer to the gospel that Jesus calls us to live.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for sitting down and having this conversation with me today.
Thanks, Ben. It was good to talk to you.
Yeah.
Take
Peace.
care.